Montana Territory, 1869. The wind was a blade against the plains, carving the snow into violent swirls that erased the horizon. Miles from any town, the great white expanse felt older than time, silent, solemn, and unforgiving. At the edge of that silence, a woman stood. Annabelle Sinclair clutched her woolen shawl tighter, her boots sinking into the deep snow as she approached the dark shape of a ranch house. Her gloved hand trembled as she raised it to knock, but before her knuckles met the wood, the heavy door creaked open. A tall man filled the frame. His eyes, the color of slate and just as cold, studied her as if she were a ghost. The lines around his mouth were taut. Through his open coat, she saw the worn grip of a revolver at his hip, and on his finger, the dull glint of a wedding band. Annabelle found her voice. "I'm Annabelle Sinclair," she said, her words a small cloud in the frigid air. "The Missouri Matrimonial Agency sent me. I am to marry a Mr. Carter." The man blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. His jaw tightened. "My name is Colt Rafferty," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel, "and I did not order a bride." A gust of wind struck her back like a physical blow, but Annabelle held her ground. There must be some mistake. The letter said this was Red Bluff Ranch. "This is Red Bluff, is it not?" "It is," he replied flatly. "But there's no Carter here. You've come to the wrong ranch, Miss Sinclair." He began to turn, ready to close the door on her and the coming storm. "Please," she said, stepping forward. "The last stagecoach has already left for Fort Banner. I have nowhere else to go." He hesitated. For a fraction of a second, the harsh lines of his face softened with something other than impatience. Then he stepped aside. "You can come in, but only for the night." Annabelle exhaled, a ragged breath of relief, and crossed the threshold. The warmth that met her felt like a distant memory. The house was sparse but solid, with a crackling stone fireplace and rough-hewn furniture. The very walls seemed to whisper of years lived without laughter. A child's bonnet hung beside a man's rifle. A small wooden horse sat abandoned near the hearth, and on the mantel, a thin layer of dust covered the portrait of a woman. Colt followed her gaze. "She passed 3 years ago," he said, his tone stiff. "My wife." Annabelle gave a soft nod. "I did not come here to replace anyone," she said quietly. "I simply have nowhere else to be." He said nothing, only gesturing toward a spare room down the hall. "You can sleep there. In the morning, I'll take you to Fort Banner." She was too tired to argue. She nodded and turned, but before she could take a step, a sound stopped them both, the soft padding of small, bare feet. From the shadows, a little girl emerged. She couldn't have been more than 5 her dark hair falling in unbrushed waves around a pale face. Her eyes were wide, haunted, as if she had seen something no child should ever see. Colt froze. The girl walked straight to Annabelle, her gaze unwavering. Then tiny fingers reached out and clutched the fabric of Annabelle's skirt. In a voice that sounded as if it hadn't been used in years, a soft, broken whisper, the child said, "God finally sent you to us." The room fell utterly still. Colt's breath caught in his throat. He took a staggering step forward. "Emmy." The little girl said no more, but her grip tightened, her small body pressing into the warmth of the stranger. Annabelle knelt to meet the child's eyes. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. "My name is Annabelle." The child's lips trembled. Are you gonna leave too? She asked, her voice barely audible. The question cracked Annabelle's heart like river ice. She touched the girl's cheek. No, she promised. Not tonight. Colt stood in stunned silence, a battle of awe and fear warring in his eyes. He looked from his daughter to Annabelle, and for the first time, his voice lost its edge. Stay, he said, at least until the storm passes. Annabelle nodded, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the storm had already arrived, and she was standing in the heart of it. The blizzard did not break. It settled over the land like a shroud, burying the hills and sealing the roads in silence. Days turned into a week, and the snow only deepened. Colt did not speak much, but he was not unkind. He repaired a loose panel in her window, added extra logs to the fire before she woke, and mended the handle of a kettle he saw her struggling with. He did these things without a word, as if repairing the house for no one in particular. Annabelle noticed, and she understood. Emmy, meanwhile, began to bloom. At first, she only watched from the edges of the room, clutching a rag doll with missing buttons. Then, one afternoon, she left a folded piece of paper on the table beside Annabelle. It was a drawing. A tall man, a woman with yellow hair, and a small girl holding both their hands. Above them, scrawled in a clumsy hand, was the word, Mama. Annabelle pressed the paper to her chest. The house was healing, perhaps, but it was not yet whole. The silence held secrets. One afternoon, while searching for extra blankets, Colt found it, an unsealed letter tucked in Annabelle's travel trunk. He shouldn't have read it, but he did. The handwriting was delicate, the words a clinical blow. The trauma to her abdomen has caused lasting damage. The likelihood of childbearing is minimal to none. That night, as Emmy slept and the wind howled, he spoke. I found a letter today. Annabelle stiffened, her gaze fixed on the fire. You read it. I did. He sat across from her. I don't want your sympathy, she whispered. You don't have it, he replied, his voice steady. Only my respect. There are scars you can see, and others that stay hidden. I think you've survived better than anyone I know. For the first time, she felt seen not as something broken, but as someone whole. A week later, she found another secret, this one drawn by Emmy. The lines were jagged, frantic. A woman with outstretched arms, a looming shadow dragging her away, and a small figure on the ground, with 3 words scrawled above him. Pa is sleep. Annabelle showed it to Colt. The color drained from his face. What happened to your wife? She asked gently. He stared at the floor, his voice hollow. I was drunk. We'd argued. When I woke the next morning, there was blood. On my shirt. On the floor. She was gone. He looked up, his eyes filled with a desolation so deep it ached to see. I've tried to remember, but there's nothing. Just the hangover and the blood. I don't know if I hurt her. He paused, the question hanging between them. Would you have stayed if I had told you? She had no answer. Seeking one, she walked to the cabin of a neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, a widow sharp as the winter air. The old woman listened, then nodded. That night, she said, her voice a dry rasp, I heard a scream. Next morning, I saw footprints in the snow leading from their place. Two sets going down the ridge, but only one came back. Did you tell the sheriff? Annabelle asked. Sheriff was Colt's cousin. Told me not to talk. The past was not dead. It had only been sleeping. Yet, as the snow fell, something inside the house began to thaw. Emmy laughed now, a sound like tiny bells. Colt taught her to ride the gentle mare, his hand steady on her back as he led them in slow circles. He was letting the light back in. One evening, as a blizzard raged, Annabelle stepped outside and the cold seized her. Colt came up behind her, pulling his own thick coat from his shoulders and draping it over hers. You'll freeze, he murmured, his breath a warm cloud between them. His hands lingered on her collar, his fingers brushing her neck. In the swirling snow, their eyes met, and she saw that the coldness was gone, replaced by a weary, fragile hope. Later, by the fire, he spoke of his wife. Her name was Eleanor, he said, his voice soft with memory. She always wore blue. She used to say I walked like a stiff ox in my boots. A faint smile touched Annabelle's lips. In that quiet room, with the storm howling outside and ghosts pressing in from all sides, a fragile thread stretched between them. It was not love, not yet. But it was no longer distance. It was a beginning. She kept this place alive long before I knew how. Taught me to cook, to hold Emmy without my hand shaking. I was clumsy and terrified around them. Babies. His smile was a flicker of light, then gone. I still wear this, he said, lifting his left hand to show the simple gold band. I'm afraid if I take it off, I'll forget the sound of her voice. Annabelle reached out, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hand came to rest over his chest, a warm press against the steady rhythm of his heart. Maybe, she whispered, she wants you to remember something else now. Not just her voice, but the way she loved you, and how much love you still have left to give. Colt swallowed, the sound rough in the quiet room. I don't know how. You do, she replied, her voice firm but gentle. You already are. His hand hovered just beneath hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating between them. Outside, the storm raged, a fierce and unforgiving wind against the glass. But inside, this fragile quiet held, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Annabelle didn't feel like a guest in this house. She felt like she had finally come home. The snow began to melt, surrendering the land inch by stubborn inch. Days grew longer, though the air still held the sharp bite of winter. Inside the house, a quiet routine had taken root. The soft scratch of Annabelle's needle through cloth, the steady work of Colt's hands making repairs, the bright silver sound of Emmy's laughter echoing from the yard. But peace is a fragile thing, a silence that often warns of the noise to come. One afternoon, while Colt was mending a stretch of the southern fence, a lone rider approached the ranch. Annabelle stood in the doorway, shielding her eyes from the low sun as the man dismounted. He wore a dust-caked coat and a battered hat pulled low, his boots dragging with the weight of a long journey. Yet something in the rigid set of his shoulders was familiar. Terribly familiar. Annabelle stepped forward. Can I help you? The man removed his hat. The face beneath was weathered by hard years, but it was a face she'd seen in her nightmares, born from a child's frantic drawings, a hard-set jaw and eyes like rusted nails. Name's Danner, he said, his voice a low gravel. Used to work this place a few years back. Heard Colt Rafferty might still be around. Annabelle's throat tightened. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Emmy had come to stand beside her, her small hand clutching Annabelle's fingers. The moment the child saw the man, her entire body went rigid. Then, with a strangled gasp, she turned and bolted. "Emmy?" Annabelle called, but the girl was gone, a blur of blue cotton disappearing into the shadows of the hall. Annabelle turned back to Danner, her own voice tight as a wire. "He's out by the south fence." Danner nodded once, a curt, dismissive gesture, and started walking. Inside, Annabelle found Emmy curled into a tight ball beneath the guest room bed, her small frame shaking with violent tremors. Annabelle knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, what is it? Who is that man?" Emmy didn't speak. Instead, she scrambled out, grabbed a piece of charcoal from the sewing basket, and began to draw on the wooden floorboards. The strokes were fast, desperate, clawing at the wood. Annabelle watched in horror as the image took shape. A woman, a child, and a looming man with a blade held high. Blood, dark and jagged. The shadowy figure from all her other drawings, now given a face. Annabelle's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood, her eyes locking on the rifle mounted over the fireplace. But before her fingers could touch the stock, the front door slammed open. It was Danner. His eyes found her with an eerie, predatory calm. "She remembers, don't she?" he rasped. Annabelle backed away. "You killed her. Eleanor." A smile twisted his lips, but it never reached those dead eyes. She wasn't supposed to be there. Neither was the kid. "But your man, Colt?" He was too deep in his bottle to see straight. He took a step forward, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from beneath his coat. "Can't have her talking now. Can't have you talking either." Annabelle lunged for the rifle, but he was faster, his arm a whip-like crack as he knocked it from her grasp. It clattered uselessly across the floor. She spun, trying to run, but he caught her by the arm, his grip like iron. A scream tore from her throat as he shoved her to the ground, the knife raised high. Then, a flash of blue from the hallway. "Emmy!" The child launched herself forward, a piercing shriek of pure terror tearing through the air. "No!" Annabelle twisted, throwing her body between the man and the girl an instant before the blade came down. The steel cut deep. A gasp escaped her lips as she collapsed, the crimson stain blooming like a terrible flower across her bodice. "Annabelle!" Colt's voice roared from the doorway, a sound of pure thunder. The sharp crack of his rifle shattered the air. Danner stumbled back, clutching a blossoming wound in his swoont. Colt advanced, the rifle still raised, his face a mask of cold fury. He kicked the knife away from the man's fallen hand and dropped to his knees beside Annabelle. The floor was dark with her blood. "Stay with me," Colt pleaded, his voice thick and hoarse. "Stay with me." Annabelle's eyes fluttered. Emmy crawled to her, her small body racked with sobs, and then, through the choking gasps, came the sound that shattered the world. "Mama!" Emmy screamed, her voice clear and terrified. "Mama, don't go!" Colt froze, his head snapping up. Tears streamed down the little girl's face as she clung to Annabelle's arm, her world breaking apart. Outside, the sound of the gunshot had drawn neighbors. One of them, a former deputy, took one look at the bleeding man on the floor and recognized Danner instantly. They sent for the sheriff. It didn't take long for the truth to unravel. With Emmy's trembling, newly found words and the neighbor's recollection of a scream heard on the wind years ago, the past finally came into focus. Danner was arrested. Colt gave his statement in a hollow, detached voice, his mind elsewhere. Nothing mattered in those hours but the fever that took hold of Annabelle. She drifted in and out of a gray, hazy world. Her skin was as pale as moonlight, her breaths shallow and faint. Colt never left her side. He sat through the long nights, bathing her brow with cool water, whispering her name, begging her to fight. Once, when the fever broke for a precious few minutes, she stirred. Her eyes, clouded with pain, found his. "You stayed," she whispered. "I never should have let you get hurt," he choked out, his voice raw. She managed a faint smile. Worth it. For her. From the doorway, Emmy tiptoed in. She climbed carefully onto the bed and, mimicking Colt, gently placed a damp cloth across Annabelle's forehead. Then, looking at Colt with eyes that held the wisdom of ages, she whispered, "She's my mama now." And Colt, broken and breathless, could no longer deny the truth. He leaned down, brushing a kiss against Annabelle's knuckles. "You saved us both," he murmured. "You saved us both." Long after the fire had died to embers, Annabelle stood at the window, watching snow fall in silent, hypnotic spirals. The wound across her ribs had mostly healed, but the ache deep inside her had only grown. She couldn't stay. Not after everything. She could never be the wife Eleanor had been. Could never give Colt the family he deserved. That morning, she sat at the kitchen table, a pen trembling in her hand. "Dear Colt, you have given me a warmth I thought I'd never feel again. But I am not whole. A war nurse sees too much, and I cannot bear children. You and Emmy deserve more than the pieces of a future I can offer. Please know that I love you both, but sometimes love is not enough." She folded the letter and placed it on the mantel, just beneath the smiling photograph of Eleanor. Then, with a heavy heart, she turned to pack. Upstairs, Emmy stirred from her nap. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She crept down the stairs, her favorite doll clutched in her arms. That was when she saw the letter. She couldn't read all the words, but she saw her own name, right after the ones she did understand. I cannot be her mother. A cold fist tightened in her chest. Emmy didn't cry. She simply turned, walked back up the stairs, and with a grim determination, pulled on her boots and her scarf. Then she slipped out the front door, into the swirling snow. By the time Annabelle noticed the door ajar, a sliver of gray against the white, the wind had begun to howl. Panic seized her. She raced upstairs, her own name for Emmy a frantic cry in the empty rooms. Nothing. "Colt!" she screamed, bursting outside into the biting wind. "She's gone!" He had just returned from the barn, a saddle slung over his shoulder. He dropped it in the snow. "What do you mean, gone?" "She read the letter," Annabelle cried, her eyes wild with guilt and fear. "She thinks I'm leaving because of her." Without a word, Colt ran for the barn. With practiced, urgent speed, he saddled the mare and hoisted Annabelle up behind him. The storm was closing in, a wall of white that swallowed the horizon. The tiny tracks in the snow were already blurring, fading beneath the wind. They searched the frozen riverbed, the stark line of winter trees, calling until their throats were raw. Emmy! Colt's voice was torn away by the gale. Emmy, come back! But only the roaring silence answered. Then, just as the last of the light was failing, Annabelle spotted it. A small patch of blue against the gray bark of a gnarled pine. She slid from the horse before it had even stopped. There, huddled at the base of the tree, was Emmy. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her doll, her cheeks a pale, frightening white, her eyes barely open. "Oh, baby," Annabelle choked, falling to her knees in the snow. "What have you done?" Emmy's lips trembled, blue with cold. You don't want me." Annabelle pulled the shivering child into her arms, cradling her with a desperate strength. "No," she whispered, pressing her forehead to the girl's icy one. "No, sweetheart. I was never leaving you. I was leaving a ghost. I thought I was protecting you both, but I was so wrong." Colt knelt beside them, pulling his heavy coat from his own shoulders and wrapping it around them both. His hands were trembling. "Don't you ever run from us again," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You hear me? You're our little girl. Nothing changes that." Emmy's small, cold arms reached up, locking around Annabelle's neck in a fierce embrace. "I want you to be my mama forever," she whispered against her skin. And Annabelle, her own tears now freezing on her cheeks, held her tighter. "Then I will be," she promised. "Forever. If you'll have me." Colt's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own in a silent, unbreakable pact. There, in the heart of a snow-swept forest, with the wind howling around them and the past finally laid to rest, a broken family was made whole. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world was new, blanketed in a pristine and silent white. Inside, the house stirred with a gentle life, a fire crackling in the hearth, soup warming on the stove, and Emmy, curled asleep under a quilt beside Annabelle, her small fingers still twined with hers. Colt stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the transformed landscape. He looked tired, but a weight had lifted from him. He looked resolved. After a quiet breakfast, he asked them to take a walk. They bundled up and stepped out into a world glittering with sunlight on snow. Down by the frozen creek, Colt stopped. "I've been thinking," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air, "about what makes a family." Annabelle waited, her heart already full. He pulled a small, worn velvet pouch from his coat pocket. He held up his left hand, showing the wedding band he'd worn for so long. "I loved her," he said, his voice clear and steady, "and I always will. But loving her doesn't mean I have to stop living." Slowly, deliberately, he slid the ring from his finger and held it in his palm. Then he looked at Annabelle, his eyes holding a world of hope. "Emmy needs a mother. And I need you." Tears welled in Annabelle's eyes, sparkling in the bright morning. "Family isn't about blood," Colt continued. "It's about who you choose, and where you choose to stay." He dropped to one knee in the snow. "I choose you, Annabelle Sinclair. Will you marry me?" But she didn't answer him. Not at first. She dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around Emmy, who had moved to stand between them. "I'm so sorry," Annabelle whispered to the child. "I'm sorry I ever made you think I didn't want you." Emmy hugged her tight. "I knew you did. I just got scared." Annabelle turned back to Colt, her hand still resting on Emmy's shoulder. She nodded, the tears finally trailing down her cold cheeks. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. He slid a simple, silver ring onto her finger. It wasn't a new beginning, but a continuation. A promise that had found its way home. A week later, the small church in Fort Banner was filled with the quiet warmth of the townsfolk. They had all heard the story of the nurse who had bled to protect a silent child, of the grieving rancher who had found a reason to live again, of the little girl whose first word was "Mama." Simple wildflowers lined the aisle. Colt stood at the altar, his hands clasped nervously. Then, the doors opened. Annabelle entered in a borrowed dress, her hair pinned with sprigs of lavender. But it was Emmy who stole every heart, walking proudly ahead in her blue dress, scattering petals with a pure, unbridled joy. When the preacher asked, "Who gives this woman?" Emmy's voice rang out, clear and certain. "I do." A soft, warm laughter filled the church, and the light in Colt's eyes was bright enough to banish any shadow. After the vows and the kiss, Emmy threw her arms around both of them, and the three of them walked out into the sunlight, no longer three separate souls bound by grief, but one family, united by grace. That night, as the fire crackled low, and Emmy slept peacefully in a small cot beside their bed, Annabelle stared up at the ceiling in quiet wonder. She whispered the words into the stillness, a truth she had finally accepted. I wasn't born to be a mother, but I was called to become one. And in that house where so much had been lost, everything, at last, felt found. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the chill of a Montana winter and the warmth of a hard-earned love, then you are the reason these stories are told. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we believe that even in a world of silence and sorrow, love finds its voice. From a forgotten war nurse to a grieving rancher, and the small footprints in the snow that led them all home. This was the story of choosing your family and becoming everything you never thought you could be. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable romances from the American frontier. Hit that bell so you never miss a tale of love that defies time, grief, or circumstance. Because some families aren't born, they're forged in courage.